So hi, I'm Hayley. I'm one of the Productivity Ninja team at Think Productive. I'm a big fan of meetings or meetings that go well. So we're going to make sure we have a big chunk of time today to think about your questions, specific questions you might have in terms of chairing meetings. Want to encourage you to chair meetings like a productivity ninja. I'm going to give you some tips about things to do before, during, and after the meeting, but I'm really interested in answering your questions. And any questions that we don't get answered, I'll make sure there's something added to our YouTube channel or kind of blog posts over the coming days and weeks to make sure those questions all get answered. But the more questions, the better, I think. But if you could head to the Q&A rather than including your questions in the chat, then that would be great. And there are some things coming through in the chat in terms of why you're here. So that's great. Thank you for sharing those. I'm the co-author, along with Graham, who's the founder at Think Productive, of our How to Fix Meetings book. Lots of the stuff that we're going to cover in the session today is included in the book, but probably a bit more, particularly in terms of answering your questions, to make sure we cover off any things that are especially relevant to chairing meetings. The book came out a couple of years ago. We also run a session called Fixing Meetings as one of our workshops that we offer at Think Productive. So thank you so much for being here. Welcome. We are going to run the session up until 2:45. But we'll keep going with questions after that if there are still questions coming through. And I can see there's lots of questions. So if you're just joining us and you do have a question about chairing meetings, if I could ask you to head to the Q&A section, and we will make sure that we spend the majority of our time today answering those questions for you. So all good meetings start with a purpose statement. This is it as we're here to learn some tools and techniques to improve how we chair meetings. I'm hoping you're going to take something away from today. I'm going to ask you later on to share any kind of specific things that you're going to have a go at doing. Feel free in those questions to share any kind of particular scenarios that you've been dealing with. You know, what do I do when? Type questions, and you can post those anonymously as well if you prefer. It's interesting when we think about what makes a great chair. I think there's a lot of pressure actually to make a meeting work put on the person who's chairing the meeting. And very often the person who's chairing the meeting is the person who's kind of convening the meeting, who's saying kind of like, we all need to get together on this. Sometimes the person chairing the meeting is someone who is deeply invested in perhaps what's being talked about. Maybe in those situations, it's better to have somebody who's not deeply invested chairing the meeting. You don't want it to be the person doing the chairing, doing all the talking, for instance. So it'd be lovely if you want to head to the chat and just give me some thoughts about what do you think makes a really great chair? Don't be shy. Yeah, being organised. Thank you, Libby, kicking us off there. Timekeeping, the importance of sticking to the agenda is something that people are mentioning a lot here. Ensuring everyone speaks, and that's an interesting one. I think it's about ensuring everybody has an opportunity to speak if they want to. Equally, there's a lot more awareness now than there was even a few years ago, I think, about neurodiversity, just some people who don't necessarily like speaking out in public. And that's a really good reason to keep our meetings small. The more people we have in the meeting, the more complicated those communications become. So making sure that everybody has an opportunity to express their views, whether that's through speaking or whether that's through doing things in a different way. So lots of stuff coming up there in the chat around engaging, scheduling breaks, keeping to time, sticking to the purpose, knowing when to move people on to the next point. I love that. Thank you, Liz. That's really helpful because actually that's quite a skill. And I think when you're deeply engrossed and involved in the topic, that might be more difficult to keep sight of. Not impossible, but something to kind of be aware of. Tactic authority, Stephen said that sounds great. Yeah, Sarah said, I think many people find it difficult to move conversations on. Um, Someone who doesn't immediately shut down ideas. Yes, that's lovely, Laura. I've done some sessions where I've done away days with teams, and we've been doing things that involve coming up with ideas. And I get people to do one of those activities comes from the improv world actually, where people are asked, I'm going to have a party. Would you like to come to my party? And this is what it's going to be like. And one person says no and shuts down each idea about what this party is going to look like. And somebody else will say, oh, yes, and we could do this. So rather than coming up with barriers to ideas, we want to give people an opportunity to say yes, and what else? How do we build on that idea? Even if it's a completely ridiculous seeming idea, there might be some useful and less ridiculous ideas that come from an opportunity to explore that. Yeah, so lots of things coming through there in the chat. Someone who brings snacks to long meetings. Well, that doesn't have to be the chair, does it? And I think a lot of these other things also don't necessarily need to be the chair. Things like keeping to time. One of the things that Graham and I talk about in the book is the importance of not having just a chair, but maybe somebody separate to the chair whose role it is to be responsible for the timekeeping. We're expecting chairs to do a lot, and sometimes chairs are also expected to take notes. And I think chairing, timekeeping, and taking notes is just taking it a bit too far. And for our online meetings, of course, lots of AI tools that can help us with doing that now as well, rather than that being left to an individual. I think it is useful in a meeting when you're chairing, if somebody else is taking notes, which I'd suggest would be the way forwards, before you move on to the next agenda item, just asking them, okay, what actions do we have captured? Encouraging people to capture their own actions as well. Okay, so loads and loads of thoughts there in the chat about what makes a great chair. I've tried to touch on some of those things, but I think one of the things that's clear from that and the flurry of activity there is that we've all got some ideas and some thoughts about what makes a great chair. And we've probably also been in meetings where we're kind of thinking, this isn't really working, the chair's not doing a very good job. But of course, it's not just up to the chair to make sure that the meeting achieves its purpose. I want us to be thinking about anybody who's attending is part of the team of people who are looking to make that happen. And the chair perhaps sets the tone for that. They set the intention behind that. So one of the things that we talk about in our book and comes from a book called Meeting Together is the 40-20-40 model. If you think of the whole process of a meeting, the planning and the preparation, the meeting itself, and then what happens afterwards as being 100%. And before I came across this model, I was probably doing kind of 5 or 10% prep, 85% of my attention, my energy, my time was spent on the meeting itself, and maybe 10% follow through. We want to try and flip that around. We can make the meetings shorter. We can make the meetings more effective by doing good planning. And as a result of that, we get more action after the meeting, which is often what I think we're looking for. I don't know if you come across this idea of yin and yang in meetings. The yin is the deep listening, the being open to new ideas, to new suggestions, the reflection and the learning. The focus in these kind of meetings is usually on what's happened and what's happening now. The yang side of things is a lot more structured. It's where we get to do that deep work. We're really kind of being deliberately ignorant of other things around us. And deliberate ignorance is really talking about what am I choosing to ignore right now so that I can focus on this thing that I'm doing. Our yang meetings are often very action orientated and thinking about the future. But sometimes if it's all yang, we're maybe not making the best decisions because we're not doing that reflection and learning. We need a bit of both of these. In our yin and yang, we have a seed of one within the other space. And I think when you're chairing meetings, it's about knowing which is your default. So I'm much more comfortable with that yin sensitivity side of things. I like doing the deep listening, the reflection and the learning. That's why I'm a coach outside of some of my work with Think Productive. The yang meeting's about the structure, the keeping to time, having a clear agenda, sticking with that. And we need both of those things to work. But if you're chairing the meeting, it's really good to understand, where are you most comfortable? What do you prefer doing? So that you can dial up a bit of the other. Maybe it's in terms of thinking about who your meeting attendees are. Are they more yin? Do you think they're more yang? How do we bring out the opposite, so we get these two things in balance? We don't want a meeting that's all one or the other. These two things are opposing forces, and we need a balance of them to make them work. I used to go to a regular meeting that was very yang. They had about 26 items on an agenda, all decisions to be made for a 2-hour meeting. And it felt like we were just going through it and ticking boxes. It didn't feel like we were really adding any value. There was certainly no deep listening happening in those meetings. The way we changed that is that we changed the structure of the meeting to have one, maybe two kind of substantive agenda items that we did deep listening on. We got really involved in that conversation. We spent a lot more time on those things and got a lot of the other stuff done outside of the meeting wherever possible. So that's our yin and our yang. Going through this very quickly so I can get through to your questions. A lot of our meetings will be hybrid meetings. A lot of our meetings might be entirely virtual on Zoom or Teams. I met with a client this morning who are doing all of their stuff on Google Meets. So thinking about where your people are there time differences to take into account? If some people are joining very early in the morning or late at night, making sure it's not always those people who are doing that, making sure you're taking maybe more frequent breaks to account for people feeling a bit more tired. I think with virtual meetings, if you can all be joining virtually, that's probably easier to give everybody an equitable experience of taking part in the meeting. I think if you've got a meeting in person and then you've got a handful of people joining online, then we can make that work with a bit of effort and a bit of planning, but it does need to be planned differently. So, for example, we have our Ninja Away Day next week, which I'm really looking forward to. We're a global organisation and it's the UK team who are meeting up. Some of the UK team aren't based in the UK, so one person in the room will be responsible for making sure that the people who are joining us virtually are able to take part, just keeping an eye on, like, are they still there on the screen? Maybe they're putting something in the chat and alerting the chair to say, such and such wants to say something. Francis has got a question in the chat. If you're chairing the meeting, it's a really good idea to ask somebody to take on that role in advance of the meeting so that people know what they're turning up to do. Because it is a bit more tiring. You do have to be a bit more engaged and juggling more things when you're taking on that role. So before the meeting begins, then, what do we want to be thinking about? We want to have a clear purpose statement, a sentence that says, by the end of the meeting, we will have, and maybe it's just one sentence, maybe it's 2 or 3 bullet points, but we don't want much more than that. I would avoid having the word discuss. We don't want a meeting to just discuss something, because we could talk about it all day and not reach a conclusion. So what does a conclusion look like? How will we know when we are finished here? So after the session today, I want to encourage you to have a look through the meetings that you've got in the next few weeks and the ones that you're chairing, and add to your meeting invitation a purpose statement that lets people know why they are being asked to join the meeting, but also what is it that you're all going to achieve together that one person can't do on their own or that can't be done over email. In the book, there are lots of different formats of meeting that you might want to explore. So thinking about that as a menu, how can you set that up for success? Thinking really carefully about who you're inviting and inviting as few people as you need to make the decision. You don't want to be inviting lots of people, 10, 20 people, and these people are just all interested in this thing. If you're looking to make a decision, you need the key decision makers there. You need any other people who maybe they've got different skills, knowledge, expertise that aren't there among those key decision makers, so that you get diversity of thought and opinion. That's really important. And one way to make sure you get the right people there is to write a compelling invitation to them. So explaining, I'm inviting you to the meeting. If I'm inviting, so Andrew, I might say, Andrew, I'd like you to come to the meeting because this is your budget we're looking to spend. Or Joe, I'm asking you to come to this meeting because you've worked with this client before. Your experience and your insights would be really useful. Your attendance is optional, but if you can't make the meeting, could we have a chat beforehand so I get a bit of that knowledge from you? It might be that Sarah is invited to the meeting and Sarah's not really key to the decision-making process, but Sarah's expressed an interest in learning more about this product or this client or this service. So I might say, Sarah, I'm inviting you to come along to the meeting. It's part of your learning, it's part of your development, entirely up to you whether you come or not. We might say, Martha, really need you to be there because you're going to be the person leading on this piece of work in the next 12 months. So just one sentence for each person to let them know why they're being invited, what skills, expertise might they bring, and is their attendance optional or do you really need them to be there? And we're sending that information beforehand. We want to try and keep meetings short where we can, and encouraging you not to have them starting on the hour. We started on the hour today, didn't we? But very often meetings start on the hour and they finish on the hour, which means people are always overrunning for the next one. Sometimes people will say things like, oh, but do you know what? I go to the meeting and everybody's just chatting about their weekend, and that's nice sometimes. But sometimes if you're in a hurry, you just want to kind of get stuck into the meeting stuff. There can be a lack of clarity about when the meeting actually starts. So encouraging you to kind of put 5 or 10 minutes at the beginning to say, this is chat, welcome, introductions. The meeting starts at 3, 10 minutes past 3. And then to have 10 minutes at the end, potentially, where you have some time doing your actions. So rather than the meeting default length being 60 minutes, let's see if we can make it 30 minutes. Or for slightly longer meetings, have a bit of chat at the beginning and a bit of time for people to get stuck into their actions at the end. So during the meeting, we want to welcome people to the meeting. We want to be positive. We want to give them the purpose of the meeting and the kind of intention about what it is that we're trying to do. We want to allocate those roles to people. We want to make sure that people have got clear who's the chair, who's taking the notes, if there's anybody who's going to be the timekeeper. Particularly if you've got an in-person meeting and people are coming into a space that they're not too sure about, we want to make sure maybe there's somebody who's there, kind of the host, to make sure that people know where the bathrooms are, that people have got drinks before they go into the meeting. And that person who's there in your hybrid meetings to look after your online attendees. So lots of different roles that we might have. I don't know if any of you ever have meetings where somebody mentions something and it's really important and it's a really useful point, but actually it's not going to help you meet the purpose of your meeting. That's when you might put that in a car park. So you say, we're going to put that in the car park, we're going to come back to that later, or indeed between meetings. Let's move back to the purpose, but you've captured that car park item somewhere. So if it's an online meeting, you might do that on the whiteboard. The person taking notes might just have a little list of things that have gone in the car park. If I'm doing that physically in a room, I might have a whiteboard or flip chart paper on the wall to just jot down those car park things. The round robin is a way of just going around the room. What do people think about this? You might want to give people a time limit. That makes it more equitable. People have got the same amount of time to share their views and their thoughts. You could use that as a temperature check. So we've got this issue to discuss. We're thinking of making this change. I'd like to hear from everybody one concern, one thing that they think is a positive thing about this potential change. Let's go around the room and hear from everyone. Not everybody necessarily wants to do that off the top of their head, particularly people who are maybe more highly introverted might want to plan and to think about that beforehand. So when you're sending out the agenda, if that's what you plan to do, you should let people know that so they get an opportunity to think about it before they come into the meeting. Sometimes in a meeting, it might be that you're running out of time. It might be that you've got a lot to cover, and you might ask people to going into two separate groups and say, we need to cover this issue, we need to cover this issue. You pick, or maybe you put people into groups. So rather than having everybody looking at everything, you ask people to divide into smaller groups to look at that. We do that a lot in workshops, obviously, in breakout rooms. But there's no reason why we can't do it in meetings as well. Encouraging you to have some movement. People have said in the chat that some of their meetings are quite long. You probably don't need a movement break if you've got a meeting that's 30 minutes. But if you've got a meeting that's a couple of hours, you certainly will, particularly if you're online meetings. So rather than having, you could have a 15-minute break, and I'd suggest you do in a 2-hour meeting, have at least a 5 or 10-minute break. But also some opportunities to just kind of stretch, move, jump about, stand up, if that's what works for you. That movement helps to keep people focused. It helps to keep them engaged. But you're chairing the meeting. It's hard work. It's good for you too. I know there are some questions in the Q&A section around moving people on when they're talking too much, or if the same people are talking a lot more. So having some scripts, some stock phrases that you might use in those situations is going to be really helpful to you. And we can have a think about what some of those might be. Sometimes putting some constraints around people's contributions can be helpful. I suggested in the round robin that you might give people a time limit. Sometimes when I'm doing the introduction section in our How to Be a Productivity Ninja session, I give people a one-sentence constraint. Sometimes in our meetings training, I give people a one-word constraint. We often start off with one word about how you feel about meetings in your organisation. Some people manage to stay sitting on the fence with one word, but it is a lot harder. So you often get a lot of richness from putting in those constraints and encouraging people to really think, well, okay, well, I've got a constraint of one word. How do I do that? Or one sentence, or I've only got a minute to say my piece. I think as chairs of meetings, it can be really difficult to just be comfortable with a few moments of silence. That's going to work for a number of different reasons. It gives people an opportunity to just have a think rather than being in listening mode. So you might say, okay, we've heard lots of information, lots of people have given their opinions. Let's just pause for a moment so we can each have an opportunity to reflect on that. Your extroverts might not like that so much, but it will be really helpful for a lot of people in the room to just have a few moments where people aren't saying something. You could do that as a break as well if you prefer. I'm talking really quickly. Sorry, I know we've got lots of questions. I'm keen to get onto those. So some scripts. I'm conscious of time, so we'll move on. I'll assume that everyone has read the reports. I used to chair a board meeting, a board of school governors, and people weren't reading the stuff in advance. So I started saying we're going to have questions in advance. So they needed to submit their questions about the work in advance. And some people started reading the papers. I then went back to some individuals and said, could you ask us a specific question about this? Because I'm worried that, section 4 is going to get lost among all the other stuff we need to read. And I would go back to different people, asking them to specifically ask a question on that section. So we ended up with more good quality questions, but also I knew that people were reading the stuff, but I was asked them to in a slightly different way. The middle one, I think that covers it. We'll move on if nobody has anything to add. I don't think I could see myself saying that. I think I would be more likely to say something along the lines of, we've heard lots of opinions. Does anybody have anything new to add that we've not already heard? Or maybe we've heard from quite a few people. Is there anybody who's not contributed yet who would like to share their thoughts? Another good way to get some clarity, can we just summarize what we're putting in the notes? What are the actions that we're recording? As you begin an agenda item, it might be helpful to say, okay, we've got 10 minutes on the agenda for this one, or we've put in 15 minutes, but we're a bit behind schedule, so we're going to try and do it in 10. So a couple of different things that you could say. I'm sure you will develop your own as well. After the meeting, and this is really where we kind of want the magic to happen. I think it's important to set expectations. I used to go to an interagency meeting that had 5 or 6 different organisations attending to look at a particular issue. And the chair of that meeting, before I joined the group, took me to one side and said, look, Hayley, the rules for this meeting are this. If you come to the meeting, it means you've done your actions from the last meeting. And if you've taken actions from the last meeting and you haven't done them, don't come to the meeting. Use that meeting time to get the actions done. I made sure I got those actions done. That's what I was agreed to. The chair had been really explicit about what being part of that group meant. It's good to have actions. We want to wrap up each agenda item with clarity on what the actions are. It's very easy when you're in a meeting and you're discussing something that you're intrigued, engaged, that you care about, to come up with ideas and say, yeah, I'll do that. Or how about this? And the next thing you know, there's an action with your name on it. So as chair, I want you to try and remember that not all of the actions are created equal. There will be some things that people agree to do in that meeting that are mission critical. The people with those mission critical actions need to know and understand that that's a mission critical action. People who have got actions that are kind of more the icing on the cake, again, they need to understand that. So that helps them prioritize their workload. Really important to follow up. I don't know if anybody attends any meetings where the agenda begins with looking at the actions from last time. I'm hoping that people aren't doing that. It's a fairly low energy way to get your meeting started. So I want to really encourage you to do that outside of the meeting. Now, that might be you as the chair. It might be something that you delegate to someone else. Maybe people take it in turns so that somebody can get in touch with you as the chair before the meeting and say, John, I followed up with everybody. Everybody's completed their actions except for Hayley. And she said she'll have it done before Friday. The meeting's on Tuesday. She won't get it done by then, but it'll be done by Friday. So then you go into the meeting knowing that it allows you to start the meeting off with a bit more energy because that other stuff can more easily be done outside of the meeting. Encouraging you to have responsibility for your own actions in a meeting and to encourage everybody else that's coming to the meetings to do the same. Don't wait for somebody to type up the minutes or distribute the AI typed up notes. Say, you're responsible for your own actions. Please note them down. I love that in the chat. I've just seen that. We're all meant to be grown-ups. Yeah, it does add some accountability, but I guess what I'm suggesting is that you can do that in other ways. If you're chairing a meeting and you notice that some individuals are less engaged or they're not attending, really want to encourage you to follow up with them afterwards, one-to-one. Thanks for coming to the meeting. How did you find it? I did notice that you didn't contribute that much. Is there anything we can do to help you participate next time? What did you think about what we were talking about? Particularly if people are new, particularly if they have an opinion that might go against the consensus, we want to hear that. We want to hear what new people have got to say because they bring a fresh pair of eyes, and that's really valuable. Just because somebody said hasn't said anything doesn't mean they don't bring something to the conversation. It might just be that one occasion they didn't have anything to say, but it's just something to be aware of. And providing an opportunity at the end of the meeting to review success. We at Think Productive, we do the meeting was great because, and next time it would be even better if. So if you've got things where it's a regular reoccurring meeting, weekly, monthly, quarterly, then maybe every few meetings you have that conversation. So we should have time now to cover off lots of people's questions. How to ensure everyone has a voice in a complicated Teams meeting. Great question. I think that round robin is helpful. I think sometimes using a tool like a Miro board, something where people can write their answers. If I'm doing the meeting in person, I might ask people to use post-it notes to say, what do you think about this? Or what are the challenges? What are the issues? And people write that down, and we can replicate that in our online meetings by using the whiteboard or a Miro board or some other tool that people can access and type their thoughts rather than having to come in on voice to do that, because that doesn't work for everyone. Andrew says our biggest problem with meetings is persuading people to keep on topic. Tips for that would be super helpful. So having that meeting purpose, that statement before the meeting begins, that you let people know this is why we're meeting. If it's an online meeting, you might have that on a slide so that everybody can see it. If it's a physical meeting, you might even have it up on the wall to remind people this is the purpose. And having those stock phrases to hand. Okay, that's a really interesting point, Hayley. But that's not really the purpose for today. We're going to put that one in the car park. Let's get back to the purpose. Being really hot on that, I think, is super important. General advice on chairing meetings with confidence would be great. I've shared some general advice, and the confidence is interesting. Things that help with confidence are things like wearing clothes that you're comfortable in. Have you heard of power poses? There's a great TED talk around power poses. I think it's Amy Cuddy who does that TED talk. And I think it's confidence is a very personal thing. What makes you feel confident? What makes you feel unconfident in some of those meetings? Maybe thinking, well, what's the worst that can happen? And planning for that worst case scenario can help increase confidence. Maybe speaking to a coach about confidence in meetings as well, if that's something that's tricky. People being difficult when you're hosting meetings. And I guess that depends how we define difficult, right? Because people contributing too much for too long, not letting other people have a say, that can be difficult to manage. But equally, having people who don't say anything, also difficult to manage. So that getting people to write things down, again, I think that's helpful. But Rebecca would love a bit more information there about what difficult might mean. That would be great. Oh, thank you. Somebody's just put the Amy Cuddy TED Talk into the chat. What wonderful people. How to keep your agenda on track and not go down rabbit holes. Yeah, that's a good one as well. And I think making sure everybody's got a copy of the agenda, being really clear where you are at any point in the meeting on which agenda item you're on. Literally ticking them off as you go if you're chair. Recognizing, okay, I think we're starting to go down a rabbit hole. You can say that. Are we at risk of going down a rabbit hole here? This was the purpose. This is what we're looking to be discussing. And it might feel difficult to interrupt someone to say that, but do you know what? Everybody's going to thank you for keeping that meeting on track. Disengaged attendees, such as multitasking, and this is so much more the case now that we're doing a lot of meetings hybrid and virtually. I think keeping the meeting short is important. I did at the beginning of the session today, there was kind of a slide up that invited people to turn off their email. So encouraging people to have those kind of things as common practice. People often say to me in our productivity sessions, Hayley, what kind of tasks can I do when I'm in a meeting that I'm not really all that interested in? And my answer is always don't go to the meeting. If we're going to the meeting because it's in our calendar, but we're actually thinking at these other things over here are more of a priority, then maybe there's a conversation to be had about that meeting. Maybe you don't go on this occasion. Maybe you have a conversation with somebody about whether you go at all. Certainly if you're chairing the meeting, we're hoping you're not multitasking. And you can be really explicit about that. You can say, like, right at the beginning of the meeting, less than 2% of the population can multitask. So let's turn everything else off and focus our attention here. That means we'll have a better quality conversation. If you're working on something today that means you can't do that, then maybe this isn't where you need to be right now. Some people might leave the meeting. We need to be okay with that as the chair. Like, don't be contacting them afterwards and saying you weren't supposed to leave. So thinking about how we do that. And modeling that ourselves as well. It's really easy to tell when somebody's doing something else, especially if they've got two screens and their eyes are up over here. So making sure that we're modeling that and having some conversations about it too, I think is helpful. Making sure people who are reflectors have their voices heard and not just the people who shout out first. And that's, I think, Rebecca, why the planning part is so important. Letting everybody know in advance what we're talking about, what can they do to prepare, how are they going to be asked to contribute, so that they get to reflect before the meeting. I think it's human nature that all of us, introverts and extroverts and ambiverts and whatever else, that people go away and they think after the meeting, oh, I should have said this. I had this great idea, but I didn't really get time to say it. Or the light bulb moment is after the meeting when you're walking home or you know, doing the washing up. So making sure that particularly if you're making really big strategic decisions, you're not doing that all at once. That there is some inbuilt opportunity to reflect, to literally to sleep on it, to see how you feel about it, having thought it through. This is great. We've got some more questions coming through. How do you manage chairing a meeting where the attendees are more senior than yourself to make sure that everyone is able to speak? So let me get this right. You're chairing the meeting and the attendees are more senior. Okay, great question. Seniority is a very tricky thing in a meeting environment. I think there are some organisations who have nailed this. People at all levels in the organisation feel really happy to be able to share their views and their thoughts. But very often, and the research backs this up, that when you ask a question, and the evidence is pointing at one thing, you know, the data is telling us this, but the highest paid person in the group says this, people are more likely to agree with that higher paid person. So if you are the highest paid person in the meeting, giving your opinions last. If you're chairing the meeting, you probably know that there are some people in the group who are more senior than you. If it's a regular meeting or a really, really important, impactful meeting, you might even have a question, a conversation with them about that beforehand to say, you know, okay, I know I'm chairing this meeting. I might ask you to go last because you're the more senior person in the group, and this is why. Very often, people who are more senior want to jump in first to get the conversation going, and that doesn't always work. Again, that getting people to write things down early on is a really helpful tool and technique there. Mina asked that question, really happy to chat outside the meeting if that hasn't quite helped, or outside the webinar if that hasn't quite helped you with that. It sounds like there might be some specific things there, but off the top of my head. I chair a lot of meetings, sometimes with large numbers of people. I often fail to get through the agenda. So two things, large numbers of people, who's essential and who's not. Let's see if we can skim that down a bit. And we can do that nicely, right? We don't have to say to people, you're not essential to this process. We don't need you here anymore. You can say to people, I know that you're really busy, so I'm not going to ask you to sit through this meeting. I'm trying to reduce the attendees by 20% to give people some time back to get their jobs done. So that's the first thing, try and have less people. The second thing is planning the agenda. I mentioned when I was a chair of governors, the first few meetings I went had like 26 items on the agenda. There's no way we're going to get through any of that or much of that with any level of quality conversation. So we took a lot of that out of the meeting. Like, what's on the agenda that's an update? If it's an update, there are other ways of doing that. If it's a conversation, you know, we need to solve this problem, then that's a great reason to have a meeting. That's where 5 heads truly are better than one, is I think one of the quotes from Graham's How to Be a Productivity Ninja book. How do we have meetings where there are less people and less agenda items? So that's through the planning, the preparation, the stuff you do before the actual meeting. What you might want to do when you're planning the agenda for those meetings, Janet, is to have, these are things we really have to get through, and give each one a timing. So be quite realistic on how long is getting that through that going to take. What can be done outside of the meeting? Maybe you even have we'll have these couple of agenda items. If we get through the other stuff, we'll do those other things. If not, they'll make it onto the agenda for next time. We need to be a bit more ruthless when we're designing the meetings to help us and get people to really understand the problem before the meeting. So if you've got data that lets you know there's a problem, don't share the data an hour or a half before the meeting, or even worse, at the meeting. Share it and give people some time to digest it, to come back with questions, so that when they're actually in the meeting discussing, well, what are we going to do with this data? What actions do we take? Everybody is at a point where they understand the information that they're looking at, and the meeting isn't used as a training session. One of the things I did when I was a charity CEO and we had a board of trustees, I knew that some of them didn't really understand the financials all that well. So before our finance meeting, our treasurer hosted kind of 45 minutes before the main meeting. We then had a 15-minute break before going into the main meeting. But it was like, let's understand these numbers. This is your chance to ask questions, because in the meeting, we're going to be using the questions to help us make decisions, and they're slightly different things. How do you stop people waffling and not really answering the question asked? I hope that's not because I'm waffling too much. I think that putting in constraints, asking people to write things down, giving them a 1 minute. Sometimes it might be that you need to interrupt people, and you might say, okay, what I'm hearing is this, and you paraphrase back to them what you're hearing. Have I understood that correctly, or is there anything new to add? Let's hear from somebody with a different opinion. I can see a couple of hands have gone up, and I can also see that it's nearly 1:45. So I'm gonna, we've still got a handful of questions, and I will stay here till we've got those questions answered. I'm just looking to see who's got their hands up. Sarah Williams, would you like to come in on voice to ask a question? Maybe not.
Oh yeah, no, my hand wasn't up. That must.
Okay, not sure how your hands got up there. Okay, no worries. And Dennis, your hand went up too. Okay, so
I think that was my first hand, which went up at the start.
it keeps going up. Okay, sorry about that. So if you do need to hop off now, it's 1:45, but I will stick around to answer any further questions that people have in a few moments. But before you go, think about what you're going to take away from today in terms of your actions. Feel free to buy the book. That's available on Audible as well if you prefer to listen to your learning. If you're interested in some more sessions from us, we do these free sessions monthly. So you can scan the QR code there in order to find out about those. We have some public workshops coming up. They're cracking the engagement puzzle for people who manage teams, external contractors who want people to be happier, improve culture and performance. There's some information there on the session we're running on the 19th of June. On the 6th and the 7th of August, I'm doing it's one workshop, but split over 2 days. Online, it's too long to be online all day. That session is called How to Be a Productivity Ninja, and it's for people with high workloads to help you be more productive, less stressed, and know that you're working on the right thing and prioritizing well. I've just seen something saying somebody said that the session invite was for a full hour. So my mistake, but don't worry, we're going to get to those questions in a moment. Just sharing this information in case anyone needs to head off. If you are looking for an in-house session around meetings for you and your team, if you contact me directly, then and mention that you've been on the session today, you will get a 5% discount. So my contact details are there. There's a QR code for my LinkedIn profile. And we've got some more questions come in. We've got 16 questions still to answer. So I will continue answering those questions if that's okay. Where were we at? How do you avoid meetings? Reduce the need for meetings by using more digital means. I think it's about thinking, what's the purpose of this meeting? And if it's just to share information, then there are other ways of doing that. A lot of meetings go in the calendar for an hour. And if it's an hour, because it needs to be an hour and you've planned the agenda that way, then that's cool. But there might be times where we can make it a bit shorter, 30, 45 minutes. One of the things we do in our Fixing Meetings workshop is we encourage people to look in their calendar and try and get rid of or shorten some meetings and have less attendees. So people have got more time to do their work and get their stuff done, which is usually very gratefully received. Can I share any tips on time management, taking notes and allocating actions, whilst also chairing, trying to keep people moving forwards? Yeah, okay, cool. So the first thing would be not to have the same people doing all those things, meeting minutes, allocating actions and sharing. So let's separate those things out. when you're taking notes for yourself, some people like to take notes so that people can see them on the screen. What I do is I take some notes in my notebook. I quite like a bit of handwritten stuff. And I just put a capital A in a circle in my notebook next to anything that's an action for me to make that easier when I come to collect those actions at the end of the day. Anonymous question, do you think meetings with rotating chairs are a good idea or not? Yes, absolutely. I think that's great. It gives everybody that skill and that experience. It means that when people are taking part in the meeting, they've got a bit more of empathy, perhaps, understanding of what it's like to be chair and a maybe better place to help each other out. I would also encourage you, if you're doing that, to ask people to give you feedback. What could I stop, start and continue to do when I'm chairing meetings? That might give you some really good feedback to help you develop those skills more. So I'm a big fan of that rotation and sharing. Any tips for people who always talk over others? Now, this is subtly different. If it's one person who's constantly doing this, that's a conversation. It's a conversation face to face. So, you know, if it's online, because geography means that it needs to be online, then that's okay. But to be able to say to someone, have you noticed that, or I've noticed that often you might talk over someone. If you're in the meeting and I interrupt something Dennis is saying, for example, it would be great for somebody else to say, Dennis was just saying something. Could we go back to what Dennis is saying? It's much easier if somebody else does that rather than the person who's been interrupted. It just feels a bit nicer to be recognised, to be heard. There's lots of power dynamics in terms of that interruption. So if it's somebody who's a constant offender, a brave conversation that's done in the interest of helping them to be a better team member, that's done in the interest of being able to hear what everybody else has to say. Also, maybe setting out at the beginning of the meeting, if it's a meeting where people get overexcited about stuff and have got a lot to say, then perhaps there's a conversation there around saying, you know, we're all enthused about this. We get excited. I've noticed we talk over each other a lot. Here's my suggestion for how we deal with that. If it's an in-person meeting, you could have this is the talking pen. When you're holding the pen, you do that. Maybe you literally have the talking baton and, you know, I'm going to pass this to Sarah now. Sarah, your turn to speak. So we've got one person talking at once. You can have a bit of fun with that. You can be a bit silly with it, but there's a good point underneath it. There's an anonymous question. What might a good effective yin meeting look like? So I guess an effective yin meeting a meeting that was all yin wouldn't be effective. You need to have the yin and the yang. So yin is that learning, looking at the past, looking at the future. Looking at the past, looking at the present, but maybe not enough of the future. So I hope that clarifies that. Tips on dealing with situations where you're chairing an online or hybrid meeting, colleagues start to go off topic within the chat. Yeah, conversations, posting comedy gifts, etc. How do you bring people back to the topic without sounding like you're telling people off? Brilliant question. Thank you, Laura. What I always say at the beginning of my online workshops is I will say something along the lines of, we're going to use the chat. The chat will be open today. I didn't say it today, but I've had I can see some things going on in the chat and I haven't read everything there. I will usually say, we're going to use the chat today, but we're all going to head there at the same time. There will be times where I ask you specifically to contribute using the chat. We don't want to be using the chat throughout the meeting to have one conversation on voice and a different conversation in the chat. And for people who are using any kind of voice assisted technology, the chat just gets read out. So if one person's talking and then somebody puts something in the chat, they get both voices at once and then they can't hear what's being said. So I often ask people to use chat in that very specific way. There are a few more questions, so I'm heading off to look at those now. Could you mention something around round robins and requiring everyone to speak? You mentioned it and I was typing. But sometimes not even advance warning is going to be what people want. Yeah, I'm not sure what you mean by not what people want. So yeah, maybe you could clarify around that question. I will happily stick around to discuss that with you in more detail at the end. We use Miro prior to meetings and capture the agenda in the chat for everyone. Yeah, that's a great idea. Miro is a really good tool for getting people's ideas, their opinions, and giving people a chance to express what they think, either during the meeting or ideally beforehand. There's another couple of questions there about how to manage someone that talks over other people and interruptions, which was asked earlier. Any thoughts on cameras off in meetings might help neurodiverse people? Yeah, I think that's a tricky one. And it's one that often causes a lot of debate, a lot of discussion, and a lot of frustration for people who don't like their cameras to be on. I think we need to move away from this idea of thinking we all need to be kind of sat there posing and doing our hair in the camera while the meeting is taking place. But it does make it a bit more like face to face. I think maybe, you know, for introductions, maybe when somebody's speaking, they might put their camera on. If it's a team of people who meet regularly, like having that conversation where somebody might be able to say, actually, do you know what? I really don't like having the camera on. It makes me feel kind of nervous. Then people know that and they're going to be a bit more accepting. The danger is if the people don't have their cameras on, people just think they're not listening and they're not engaged and they're doing something else. But actually, a lot of people will find it easier to focus and concentrate without the cameras on. So I think that's a good conversation to have within your teams. How do you stop someone from interrupting you? So that's a slightly different take on the interruption question that we've had already. And I think it's a tricky one. And it's tricky because there might be power dynamics involved. If it's an individual who does it persistently, then I might think about getting some allies in that meeting, some people who, you know, to just be able to say to someone, it feels like this person's kind of interrupting me a lot. Could you just let me know if you notice that in the next meeting? You might ask more than one person to do that. You might ask them to call it, you know, to actually call that out and say, if you notice that, could you just let me know, or could you say something in the meeting? So yeah, that's a tricky one. And again, happy to have some conversations outside of this. I'm just trying to get through all the questions in the next few minutes. I think some of the points around purpose, audience, etc., become more complicated for reoccurring meetings. I think they require more effort for sure, but I think they're even more important. If you have a team meeting and your purpose is we're going to meet together as a team so we get to see each other, that doesn't really tell me why this team meeting in June is going to make things better for the team. How's it going to improve things? What problems is it going to solve? So I think it's really important to do that for the recurring meetings just as much, if not more so, than the other meetings. People are rude, disruptive, and disrespectful to other attendees are contributions. I think having at the outset, we talk in the book about purpose, plan, the protocol, and the people. Like, you know, the people and the protocols this is how we want to engage with each other. This is we're all here to achieve this same purpose. Our role in this meeting is to help us to come to a conclusion around X, Y, and Z. It sounds like there might be some particular things going on. Again, happy to talk to you outside of the session today. But I think just setting those boundaries and those ground rules before the meeting even happens is really helpful. People often say for reoccurring meetings, we'll only meet if there's something to talk about, but inevitably an expectation is created that you might meet anyway, or be asking every time if it's required. I think at the very least, people should review these reoccurring meetings regularly. Definitely, yes. Especially if they're the chair or an organizer, to ensure they are still required. Yeah, and one of the things that you might want to do with those reoccurring meetings, if they're feeling a bit stale, skip them. Miss 2, miss 3, and see what people miss. What did you miss about not meeting last week? and then maybe replace it with something new that goes to those things that people missed. Okay, there's a few more questions here. Rotating chairs, how involved should they be in putting together the agenda and other pre-meeting planning? Kind of depends on the meeting, I guess. My instinct is to say like very involved, but maybe not. Maybe somebody else does that pre-planning, and they turn up and chair the meeting. When I'm facilitating sessions, I like to be kind of involved in the planning. I have facilitated kind of things before where people have said, oh, here's the agenda. And they've done the planning. I'm like, oh, that's not quite how I would have done it. I think this needs a bit of work. So yeah, I'm going to stick with my gut feeling on that. I think they should be quite involved, unless there's a good reason why not. Do I have any good ideas for icebreakers to use in meetings? Sarah, yes, that's exciting. Somebody challenged me a few weeks ago on the term icebreaker. They sort of said it assumes that the ice needs breaking. So maybe it's a warm-up. Lots of great stuff out there online. I like to start a meeting with asking people to share something positive, something that's gone well for them. By everybody sharing something positive, that means that they are contributing, but in a positive way. And that means if they've got a question or a criticism later on, that makes it a little bit easier. Okay, there are a couple of questions left, but we're running out of time. A meetings charter with agreed behaviours, is that a good idea? Yes, 100%, absolutely. You mentioned that updates can be handled outside of meetings. What would you recommend as good ways to disseminate updates? I mean, I quite like an infographic. That's nice. It catches people's attention. It's a bit more engaging than an email. You can do it on Canva quite quickly. You might use Loom, where you can do a very quick video. You can do a free up to 5-minute video on Loom. So that might be quite a good way to do it. One of my clients does an update. The update is, what have you changed? Why is it going to affect me? And that's all that people need to know. So giving, that information update maybe needs a bit more work. Okay, I can see there's loads of questions in the chat. I can see we've still got a handful of questions in there. So we've reached the 3 o'clock, so we're going to wrap things up there. But if anybody does need any further help, then do please get in touch. And do please, if you're interested in an in-house workshop, if you get in touch with me to get that booked before the end of this month, we will give you a 5% discount for being here today. So thank you all very much. Lovely to see and hear from you. And thank you for all your brilliant questions. Take care. Bye-bye.